Eager to get an idea out there, but worried about how long it's going to take you and your team to execute? Well, in today's Build episode, we're going to show you how you can embrace design sprints as a way to test your ideas and get your prototype out there faster. Welcome to Build, brought to you by Pivotal Tracker. I'm your host, Purnima Vijay Shankar. In each episode, innovators and I debunk a number of myths and misconceptions related to building products, companies, and your career in tech. One misconception a lot of us fall prey to is this need to do a massive build out before we launch a product. The results, unfortunately, are that we end up spending a lot of time, money, and energy possibly building the wrong thing. And as a result, customers don't want it, teams burn out, and companies lose sight of their business goals. In today's episode, we're going to tackle this misconception, share with you how you can embrace design sprints to help you iterate faster and get your prototypes out there. And in future episodes, we'll talk about how you can evangelize design sprints within your organization and handle any pushback that you might get from your teammates or stakeholders. And to help us out, I've invited Sharbel Saman, who has been a product designer for the last 20 years and recently launched his brand Made in Public. Thanks for joining us today, Sharbel.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So for our audiences out there, let's start by digging into your background a little. I know you've been a designer for the last 20 years and recently started Made in Public, but walk us through that evolution.
Sure. So I started out as a designer, self-taught, when I was 15 and fell in love with it. And I continued to design through college, would dabble with side projects, and never formally studied it and was formally trained, but continued to develop my skills as much as I could. And I've had this interesting blend of design specialties throughout my career. I've done product design, brand design, I've done curriculum design for training programs, and bringing all of that together, I've realized I've gone broad in my career or wide in my career. Mm-hmm. And what I enjoy most is using design as a way to solve problems, as a methodology, and I also enjoy teaching it. I enjoy teaching design so people can embrace it in whatever area of work they do.
Yeah, that's great. So now what does Made in Public do?
Made in Public now combines all of that,
yeah.
And I get to run my own side project, design sprints. Mm-hmm. I run sprints publicly so people can see what it's like to go through the process of going from idea to action in a very short amount of time. Mm-hmm. And then in that way as well, I use it as a way to teach. So I really like to teach design through live experiments.
So let's dive into today's topic of design sprints. And before we talk about what design sprints are, let's maybe start with that product design background that you have and showcase what you saw was broken and why the need maybe for a new process.
Sure. I think part of it is that there may not always be something that's broken per se. I think design thinking has influenced my career heavily. And I've learned a lot through what IDEO has put out into the world and other great design firms out there. And I think design sprints, in some ways, it's a derivative of design thinking. It's another way of thinking about the design process. Mm-hmm. And what it can help guard against or help avoid are things like decision deadlock. Mm-hmm. Or it helps guard against overthinking what the big thing should be, and it helps you pare down because of constraints. You have 5 steps, and according to the Google Ventures Inspired Design Sprint, and Jake Knapp and the co-authors, the 5-day approach constrains you. So you're not trying to build something that could take you 5 months.
Right.
Really, you're trying to create something in 5 days.
So let's talk about what that looks like. You know, what is that design sprint over those 5 days?
Sure. The first step of the 5 steps, or 5 days, depending on if you want to compress it even further, the first step is to understand, map and understand, and unpack the problem you're trying to solve and for whom you're solving it. Mm-hmm. And I think for anybody who's creating any kind of product, it's always essential to get down to what problem am I solving and who has the problem? Yeah. And do I understand that person and their journey and how they first might interact with my product, all the way through to the interaction and to the end result, or what I like to call the desired outcome. Mm-hmm. But what's the desired outcome that they want after using your product? What is it solving?
And it's one person. So a lot of times we have multiple users or multiple personas, but in this design sprint, we're going to limit ourselves to one persona.
You can, and it's important in that unpacking and understanding to understand who might the other people be. So if there are multiple people, acknowledging that and having an understanding and awareness of that is great.
Right.
And then you might, through the rest of the course of the sprint, you might say, we're only going to focus on this one particular person or particular user of the product, because that's basically the breadth that we have. And we can't really do much more. We know we've got other folks, but we're at least going to focus this sprint on this person.
Got it.
And then that leads to, when you understand the problem, you understand that person and how they're facing that problem, then the second step is to sketch. And this is a fun part where this is where most people want to get into brainstorming and get a lot of ideas on the table. And one of the things I like to say, and I borrow this from what I've learned through IDEO, is to think with your hands. So now you get to actually get pen to paper, pen to Post-its, and you get to sketch a variety of solutions. And if you've got about 6 or so people in the sprint with you, even if you're running it with a co-founder or you're running it solo, this is where you get a chance to get a variety of sketches out on the table or out on paper.
Okay.
The third step is to decide. Once you go through all the sketches that you've laid out, and through a number of exercises like noting and voting and dot voting, there are a number of different ways to approach it. You actually decide, what will the blueprint be for your prototype? Yeah. And then the prototype is the fourth step.
Yep.
That's where you actually get to create a realistic version of what you want this product to be, or this service for that matter. And you can get it out to real users by the fifth step or the fifth day. And that's where folks get to interact with what you've created through the prototype. And then you can learn and observe and understand what you can improve. Or did you, and this is a key part, did you validate your hypothesis? Did you validate or invalidate what you had sought out to figure out?
So there's a few things going on. Let's kind of unpack them in more detail. So the first is, you mentioned this concept of voting and dot voting, which I like the concept a lot, and I've started implementing it, but maybe for our audience out there who's not familiar, we can shed some light into what that is.
Sure. So one of the exercises after you've gone through sketching, let's say you're in a room with about 6 people. You're running a sprint with 6 people. And all 6 people have generated really interesting ideas and really interesting concepts or mock-ups of what the product might be. Dot voting and noting and voting, especially if you've decided ahead of time, and hopefully you have, who the decider is. There will be one person who's going to be the decider, and they get the majority vote, or they get extra votes,
right?
Or extra votes. Dots. Yeah. Exactly. And one of the things that's fun is doing what's called like a museum gallery, where everyone's mock-ups on their 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper and Post-its go up on the wall. Everyone has a chance to review everyone else's mock-ups, and you can vote with dots, like a marker and dots, on the elements or aspects that you find compelling or you find interesting. And when it comes to decision time, after the voting and whatnot, you actually get to distill the best ideas from the entire group. And that's one of my favorite aspects of the sprint, is that some people say, oh, I'm not very creative, or I'm not the designer, or I'm not the engineer, I'm not the technical person. Yeah. But what I've found is when you bring a collective creative together like that, then sometimes the best ideas come from someone you might not expect to come from. Right. And then the voting allows for decision making, because you can't do all the features. Yeah. So the voting helps you distill it down to some of the key elements that you want to focus on for the prototype.
So let's talk about who needs to be involved in this process. We've already kind of mentioned that designers, engineers are great, people who are going to be building out that final prototype, but who aside from them needs to be involved?
Great question. I found what's very important is to have someone who is part of the overall decision-making process. That can either be one of the founders or any of the founders or all of the founders, someone who's at a VP level or a C-suite level, depending on the structure of your organization and how large your organization is.
So maybe whoever understands like the business goals? The business
goals, for sure. And anyone who is even involved in sort of the direction and vision of the overall business. Okay. So certainly the people who would be doing the building itself and the designing itself, and definitely folks who are involved in the business side of things.
But why? I mean, doesn't that feel like they're micromanaging, and shouldn't they just trust their designers and engineers and let them run free?
Yeah, it's a great question. One one of the key principles of design that I've embodied and believe in so much is this two-part or twofold aspect of inclusivity and collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to be inclusive and collaborative, and that avoids this waterfall effect where if just the engineers and the devs and the designers are in the room and the so-called business folks are out of the room, then it becomes this, now let's go back and take it to them and show them this, get approval. But when folks are in the room together, that's when those ideas can come out. And more often than not, an idea gets sparked from one person, and especially if you embrace this yes and approach, it's like, oh, that's a great idea. You know, what if we also did this, or could we also try this? I didn't think of that. That's great. Okay, and then you get back to that voting and say, great, we can't do it all, but let's distill. But you actually have a richer conversation and a richer collaborative experience when you include more aspects of the business.
Yes, I think it's great that you're bringing all these people to the table, involving them in the process. Now, that's obviously a lot of overhead, right? For a founder or for a VP or some of these people to come in and sit in on a 5-day design sprint, I'm sure there's going to be some pushback around it, which we're going to get to in the next episode. But for the purpose of this episode, how do we kind of constrain the time so that they don't feel like they're sitting in a whole day session?
Right. I think there are a couple of ways of approaching it. One is to think about design sprints more as a mindset or an approach. And the pushback I hear a lot is this 5-day.
Yeah.
We don't have 5 full days to have 6 critical members of our team. And I completely understand that, and it makes a lot of sense. The response I often share to that is, would you rather invest up front in those 5 days where all 5 or 6 of you or 7 of you can come in and you're investing that time, which is money, I understand. Would you rather invest that and have the opportunity to come out with something that yields you a real opportunity to engage with a real prototype with real people in 5 days instead of 5 months?
Yeah.
Instead of 5 months of a bloated product that you're not even sure is actually something that people want or are going to use or pay for.
Right.
You haven't validated. And you may have those silos that you mentioned earlier, and there tends to be tension. I mean, we've experienced it where there's tension between engineering and design and product and marketing and sales, et cetera. And you mentioned earlier about the business folks. It can be the founders. It can be the head of sales. It can be anyone who's involved, right, in key elements of the business. And when you bring them together for those 5 days, you tend to circumvent a lot of wasted money, wasted time. And I come back to decision deadlock. That's a key thing I've noticed is the inability to get through that decision, that blocker.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah.
Sure. The key thing about this sprint, and whether it's 5 days, sometimes it can be compressed to 3 if done well. And I've tried 1. It's very hard.
Yeah.
It's extremely challenging to do it in 1 day, so I don't always recommend that. But the key part about the decision deadlock in the sprint, and when you're using the sprint as a methodology, as an approach and a mindset, as opposed to fixating on the number of days and time, is it's going so fast and there are so many constraints that constraints lead to clarity. And you don't have a whole lot of time to spend on, should it be this way or should it be that way? You're simply saying, here are the ways, let's pick one and let's try it. And we're going to find out if it's validated or not.
Right.
And then we can run another one again.
I see. So that's great. Yeah, because I think that's actually, I was going to ask the question around scope creep, but it sounds like if you're whittling things down, it becomes very obvious what that particular thing is that you're building, whether it's a feature or, whatnot, and what the problem is that you're solving versus all these other problems that might be tangential.
Right.
So yeah, you get that real level of focus, but I'm sure unifying people around what that one thing is a challenge.
It is. That's why it's important at the start of the sprint, for me as a facilitator, to first get permission and to get that commitment from everyone that I'm here to facilitate. I'm here to guide the process and really help extract or be able to foster and cultivate their ability to create and to go validate what it is they're trying to find out. And the second part is having that decider in the room. And when everyone agrees and commits to who the decider is, and for that decider to be convicted in their decisions.
Yeah.
And to truly commit to a lot of these things are great things we can do. We could save them for another sprint.
Right.
We're really going to hone in on focus on this particular aspect.
So I could imagine that whoever that decider is needs to have done their homework and be really wedded to the customers, the problem. But are there ever times where they're not sure? They may need to say, oh, you know what? There's two problems here. Not really sure which one. I need another day to go back and do research, or a week, in which case now you're holding up the sprint.
Yes, great point. Again, the beauty here is because you're aiming for that fifth step or that fifth day to get the prototype in front of users. To take another day, which will turn into a week, as you said, is not helping anyone.
Yeah.
So instead, note that you've got this second thing that you might want to do, or you think you have a hunch that maybe that's also a problem. It very well could be, and that's perfectly fine. And just let it be there.
Yeah.
And pick one and go with it and get to that fifth day or get to that fifth step. Get the feedback, learn from it, and observe how folks are interacting with it, whether it's a feature, like you said, or it's the entire mock-up of the product, and then iterate and do it again.
Okay, yeah. So then there's not a lot of leeway for ambiguity, and you have to get comfortable making those firm decisions to keep the sprint moving forward.
Absolutely. I think that's the key part, is to be convicted in your decisions and keep moving forward, because this is a sprint.
Yeah.
You're just getting to that finish line.
So we've talked about, these 5 days. Day one is sort of this brainstorming session.
Day one's actually unpacking and understanding. You want to have a good understanding of the problem and who has the problem. Then you go into sketching a variety of solutions. The third day, you decide what you're going to prototype. Fourth day is the actual prototyping. And the fifth day is getting that prototype in front of real people.
Okay. So how do you know, once you've done these 5 days and put something out there, whether or not the sprint was successful?
That can vary sometimes from team to team and people to people, and depending on the product and service. What I like to anchor to, though, is, did you get some level of a light bulb moment or aha moment? Did you learn something? If you didn't learn anything by the end of the sprint, then you may not have understood the problem as deeply as you thought you did, and you may not have understood the person for who you're solving it for.
Nice.
So I like to measure it in terms of, on one hand, there's the analytical side.
Sure.
Like, do we get buy-in, or do we get people who are turning into customers saying, if you're going to launch that and that actual product in the next 2 weeks or month, okay, here's my pre-order. Great. On the other side of it, have you learned something from it?
So even if it's an epic failure, nobody likes it, they thought the feature was just crap, there's insight there where it's like, hey, we're not going to be building that.
Right.
We're not going to flesh that out in greater detail.
Like the majority of my products and ideas. I've learned something, though, or the team has learned something. If it's an epic fail, great. Don't. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier. Would you rather have the epic fail and realize that in 5 days, or 5 months later after you spent tens of thousands of dollars or more? If you're outsourcing it, tens of thousands or more. If you've got an internal team and you've got all your engineering and design and development time and dollars, that aha moment can go on the positive. Let's keep moving forward with this. We're on to something. Or it's the, okay, start over, but at least we only spent 5 days doing it.
Right. Yeah, so I think that time investment is great. And I think even in those epic failures, a couple things develop. You now have a process with your team. So there's some camaraderie and some communication barriers that have been broken down. And then there's still some interesting customer insights. A customer telling you, hey, I didn't like this feature. What I was really looking for was XYZ. That's a valuable conversation to have. And so just kind of developing, like you said, that confidence around, okay, I'm going to practice active listening for what it is they're looking for.
Great point. There are two things that you just triggered a couple of thoughts for me. One is on the team communication and bonding front. What I've noticed is the team ends up developing a common language and a common baseline or foundation to work with. But next time I'll hear something like, well, why don't we go sketch this? Yeah. Let's go sketch something that we're talking about a lot of ideas or a lot of ways that we could do this feature. Let's just sketch them out and let's vote on them. Right? And let's make sure one of us is the decider, whatever it might be. the other part that you mentioned around the lessons that you'll learn from the actual people who are interacting with it is, more often than not, in my experience, folks don't simply say, I don't like that feature, or that didn't solve my problem, thanks, bye.
Right.
They're usually walking through, and if you're facilitating that empathy interview and that observation time, you're asking questions like, could you walk through, think out loud how you're engaging with this? More often than not, they're going to say something like, well, this confuses me. I'm not sure what this does. I kind of wish it would do this.
Yeah.
Or you could ask, well, what do you wish it would do for you? And you're going to learn so much more. You're not, it's not a binary, they didn't like it and you're going to walk away. Right. You're still going to learn so much, like you said. Okay,
so we've run a sprint. We got some feedback. Maybe it was successful. Maybe it was not successful. But what's the next step?
The next step, I think, is to understand, what did you get out of it? So what was the yield? Did you learn something about what's working and you want to double down on that? You can double down on that in your existing product development methodology, whatever you have. Maybe it's agile and whatever it might be. If it's something that turned out to not work out so well, it was a failure, if you want to call it that, then you could think about, well, could we run a sprint on one of those other ideas that we sketched out? Or taking what we learned from the people who interacted with it, it turns out we had that in some of the sketches. Why don't we incorporate that next?
Nice. Yeah.
And so you may not run another 5-day sprint the following week, but you now are so much more informed about your existing product development cycle. That you could start to pull in some stories if you run agile or whatever your approach is.
Okay, so the idea is to use design sprints for moments where you've got a lot of ideas, you're not sure which one to execute on, and really for that quicker design feedback, but not as a standalone methodology for every week we're doing a design sprint.
I don't think so. Yeah, I think it works out better in the way you described it. And I think particularly sprints are great when you start to notice a little bit of that clog. You're getting into that decision deadlock, or you've got a problem you want to solve, but you're just grinding on it.
Right.
The sprint allows you to just get moving. It allows you to go from thinking to action. And same when you have a new idea. You've got lots of new ways that you think, well, we think we might be able to roll out a feature that could generate another $100,000 in revenue. Or we think we could do a branch off the product, and there's this whole other market, and that could be $1 million product on its own or more. Well, run a sprint on it instead of thinking about it or figuring out, could it be, should it be, and what do we do with it?
So I'm sure other teams, maybe marketing, sales, customer support, all these other teams out there are probably going to start embracing design and using it. Have you seen the design sprints used for other things?
Yeah, actually, this is my favorite part. It's not just for product teams, at least anymore. Two favorite examples of mine where teams you might not expect have used design sprints and they've used them successfully. The learning and development team at Medallia used a design sprint. We ran a design sprint to think about how could we start scaling training across the entire company through video and through online learning. And we ran a sprint where we had a scrappy video setup in one of the small corner offices. And we got out an example, a prototype of a training video on a completely low, tight budget. And it showed a proof of concept to the team and to the entire organization what's possible. My other favorite example is my friend Brian Batista at SoundHound. He's the customer support person and customer success for SoundHound. And he's been transitioning actually and has officially transitioned to the product marketing team because of a prototype and a sprint that we ran.
Cool.
So not necessarily on the product itself, but he was helping educate on the product and wanted to ensure that people are using SoundHound and Hound in the best possible way. And what he wanted to do was test a new type of video that was more personable, could showcase a little bit more of the humanity of the brand and the personality of the brand. And in 8 hours, believe it or not, ran a prototype on what that video could be, takes it to his VP of marketing, and she loved it and greenlit more videos. Well,
thank you so much, Charbel, for teaching us about design sprints
today. My pleasure.
Yeah. And for all of you out there who are watching and listening, Charbel and I want to know, is there something that you've been stuck on, maybe a decision deadlock when it comes to a product or a service, or even something in your personal life? Let us know what it is in the comments below this video. That's it for today's episode of Build. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive the next episode, where we'll dive into how you can evangelize design sprints at your organization. Ciao for now. This episode of Build is brought to you by our sponsor, Pivotal Tracker.